So Christmas is this next weekend here. So this is the last Sunday before Christmas, 2021, and it's been an odd couple of months. Let's be honest. Uh, I actually felt like, for me personally, I felt like 2020 was rough, and then I was looking forward to 2021, and I think 2021 was rougher than 2020. Um, Obviously, there's just a lot of, I can't even go through the number of things. Um, but how many of us here have ever been in? You don't have to show your hands, but how many of us have ever been in a cave? I remember when we were young. I don't know if you remember Billy went to Luray Caverns in Virginia. Um, and so, how many of us have ever been in a cave? I read about a tour of a place called Mammoth Cave, and I think that's in Kentucky, right? Have you been there? Been there. So you guys can kind of relate to this a little bit. The tour guide stopped and asked the crowd, "You want to see what a real cave is like?" Did they do this to you? Maybe the story is the same. You let me know if it's the same. So, thinking that he was going to take them like on a side trip to a really cool cave or something different than the usual tour, everybody's like, "Yeah, we want to see what a real cave looks like." And so, without another word, the guide reached in and shut off all the lights. Is that what he did? They did that. So this is a true story then. That's good. And he says, that's what a real cave looks like. Completely dark and void of all light. You just can't see anything. Probably did have a flashlight, didn't you? Brother David had a flashlight. He happened to have a bag with a screwdriver and a few screws in there just in case. Some extra batteries. A flashlight. Caves can be really scary places, especially when the lights are out and everything's dark. In the total darkness of these moments, many people begin to get a little edgy, a little uncomfortable. It's completely pitch dark, and aside from your flashlight, you'd have to try to feel your way out of a cave. In fact, if the lights remain off for any length of time, I would predict that you'd see many people begin to panic. You'd see a lot of commotion and panic going on. Most people don't like sitting around in darkness. We learn from an early age to be fearful of darkness. And that's why nightlights are so popular in little children's bedrooms. That little glow of that tiny light bulb is just enough to take the edge off and make a child feel comfortable in the room. Even as we grow up, there's still a fear of the dark for many, and if you hear a strange noise in your house in the middle of the afternoon, you'll think, "Oh, wow, that was a strange noise," right? I don't know what that was. But if you hear that same noise in the middle of the night at 3 a.m., okay, now it's a little scarier, and your wife's going to nudge you and say, "Hey, go check that out." Or for some in here, maybe the husband's going to nudge you and say, "Hey, go check that out." Would you? Go see what that is. Right? So, it's a lot different. We perceive things sometimes a lot differently in those dark times than we do in the middle of the day. Darkness is uncomfortable, and darkness can be confusing. And at times, darkness can be terrifying. And this is a Christmas message, by the way. We have Isaiah chapter 9, and God talks about people sitting around in darkness. They're uncomfortable, they're more than just a little confused, and they're seriously afraid for their future. Isaiah promised that a virgin would conceive and give birth to a son. There are heretics who reject the idea of the virgin birth. There are heretics that reject that. Even some preachers and theologians refuse to believe God could or would do such a thing. They're out there. Their God has no power and no desire to intercede in the lives of men. Some of them not only reject the idea of a virgin birth, but they even reject the idea that the prophecy had anything to do with Jesus. But the Jews had long considered this section of Isaiah to be of messianic nature. We'll kind of get into that a little bit. More than 500 years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the Jews returned to Judea from their longtime captivity in Babylon. Remember the Babylonian captivity. At about that time, Jewish leaders began to write commentaries on various Bible passages or Old Testament passages, and they called them targums, T-A-R-G-U-M, targums. And so they called them targums, and one of these targums dealt with the prophecies about out of Isaiah. And that targum, written more than 500 years before Christ was born, commented on Isaiah 9:6. And there was called his name from of old. This is part of the Targum. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, he who lives forever, the Messiah, in whose days peace shall increase upon us. That's the Targum of Isaiah. So for over 500 years, the Jewish people knew that this section of Isaiah was specifically speaking to the coming Messiah. Coming Christ. In Isaiah chapter 7, told Israel that the coming Messiah would be born of a virgin. But now, 2 chapters later, Isaiah continues that prophecy. He tells them where the child of that virgin would minister. And he tells us what the child of that virgin would accomplish. First, Isaiah told Israel where the child would minister. Isaiah 9:1. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the future, he will honor Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea along the Jordan. Notice Isaiah says the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. Years before this prophecy, shortly after Solomon died, we had a split. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel rebelled, and they split from the other two. You remember hearing about this? It's actually something cool. Maybe we'll study that sometime. So they formed a new nation in the north, and that nation's called Israel. Okay? While the remaining 2 tribes in the south became known as the land of Judah. So you had Judah in the south, Israel in the north. Zebulun and Naphtali were 2 of these 10 tribes in the northern nation of Israel. But they were relatively insignificant tribes. Who's ever heard really great stories about the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali? I mean, we hear great things about Judah. We hear great things about, well, even Benjamin. We hear great things about the Levites, the tribe of Levi. You know, and so, but what have we heard come from Zebulun and Naphtali? They were rarely mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament and were never spoken of as having any important role in anything. That is until God mentions them here in Isaiah chapter 9. Now remember, these are the only tribes in the northern Israel that God included through Isaiah's prophecy to the coming Messiah. So we have these 10 tribes that make up Israel and the 2 that make up Judah. And the 2 that are mentioned being correlated with the coming Messiah are Zebulun and Naphtali. Okay? I wonder why that is. This part of Isaiah is dealing with identifying the coming Messiah. So let's think about where Jesus lived for a minute. We know he was born in Bethlehem, south of Jerusalem, in the land of Judah. But then Herod, remember Herod wanting to kill everybody? Herod learned about the prophecy of a king being born in Bethlehem, and he wasn't happy. He saw this new king as a threat to his own throne, so he sought to kill this Jewish king, this soon-to-be prophetically proclaimed Jewish king. But warned in a dream, Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt with Jesus. Remember this. And they remained there until King Herod died. And with that threat to Jesus removed, the family returned. They were able to return to their home. Because Herod's not out there trying to kill them anymore, kill the baby, kill the young boy. But not their home in Bethlehem. They'd returned to their home that they left years before, their home in Nazareth. In Nazareth, if we remember, we talked about Galilee a few weeks ago. Nazareth was in the region of Galilee. And we talked about Galilee and how it was like the fishermen and the workers, and it wasn't known to be like the religious hub of the area. Right? So that's where they went back. Guess which tribes once inhabited the land of Galilee? Zebulun and Naphtali inhabited that land. Matthew tells us that early in his ministry, Jesus left his home in the town of Nazareth, and in Matthew 4:13-16 it says, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah, land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way to the sea along the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Now, isn't that interesting? Galilee was the area, the land occupied by Zebulun and Naphtali, and we read about that a couple minutes ago in Isaiah, how the Messiah would be coming from this. When Jesus began his ministry, he resided in Capernaum, in Galilee. It was in Galilee that Jesus performed his first miracle. It was in Galilee that he selected the 12 major disciples. We talked about this a few weeks ago. We're talking about back to Galilee. And it was in Galilee that he spent most of his time preaching and teaching and performing various healings and miracles. It was all taking place in Galilee. Jesus literally brought the light of his ministry to the people who lived in the land that had once been occupied by Zebulun and Naphtali. And he's fulfilling the prophecy in Isaiah right now. He's fulfilling it. So Isaiah told us where the child born of a virgin would minister, but he didn't stop there. He went on to say what he would do. In Isaiah 9, chapter 9, verses 2 and 3, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when dividing the plunder. In the day of Jesus, Galilee, or the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, was considered a very dark land. It was a backwater region where only the poor and the not so well-off people lived. And that's where he was. The uneducated lived there. It was not an enlightened area. When Peter and John spoke before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 4, if we remember, this, they amazed the leaders of Judah because they were obviously Galileans. Remember, they go and speak, and they were amazed at how well they spoke, being from Galilee? Because Galilee wasn't known to be educated people. It wasn't known to be of people that spoke well. And so they were amazed at this. They were unschooled, ordinary men, but they spoke with courage and power. Galilee's reputation was such that Philip told Nathanael that he'd found the Messiah, and Nathanael said in John 1:46, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Right? I mean, this is the area that we're dealing with. But Jesus lived in this obscure part of Israel on purpose. And he was fulfilling this prophecy. He lived there so that he could drive home that his life was meant to shine. A very powerful and hope-filled light. We even saw that light being referred to in Isaiah. During his ministry, Jesus said in John 12:46, "I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness." And in John 8:12, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." But what was that light meant to change in our lives? What was that light meant to change in the people's lives there? Isaiah 9:2 said, "The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined." They lived in the land of the shadow of death. We were talking about the cave earlier and darkness. Death can be a very dark and scary prospect. Something that we're very uncomfortable thinking about. It's something that we're very uncomfortable talking about. And it can be scary. But Jesus came into this world to bring the light of his hope to a world afraid of darkness and death. And that's what that light is. In Hebrews 2:14-15 it says, "Since the children have flesh and blood, Jesus too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death." Years ago, a Christmas card company put out a Christmas card with the title, "What if Christ had not come?" I couldn't imagine nowadays a Christmas card company putting that out, because everybody's afraid to talk about Jesus. But it was founded on Jesus' words in John 15:22 when he said, "If I had not come." Inside the card, they told the story of a preacher that had fallen asleep and dreamt of a world without Jesus. And in his dream, he finds himself at home looking through his house. It's Christmas Day, but there are no stockings hung by the chimney, no bells, no ringing in the church steeple, no wreaths, and no holly. There were no churches, no books in his library about Jesus. This is all in the card. Suddenly, there's a knock on the door, and a young man asked the preacher to come to his house. And his mother was dying. Would the preacher have the words to comfort her? So the preacher picked up his Bible, but when he opened it to look for comforting scriptures, he noticed it ended in Malachi. Jesus hadn't come. There were no gospels, no promises, no hope. All he could do was bow his head and weep. He bowed his head and wept. 2 days later at her funeral, he had no words of comfort and hope because there was no consolation nor hope of eternity with Christ. There was nothing he could do. See, without Jesus, there's no light to push back the darkness of death. Paul talks about the great hope. Jesus being that great hope, the resurrection being that great hope. Without Jesus, The grave remains a final door from which there's no returning. Because unless Jesus was who he said he was, nobody had ever come back from death. But we know Jesus was who he said he was. And even while he was here, he raised those from the dead. Now there's a difference between Jesus' miracles of raising people from the dead and raising from the dead for eternity with him. Because Jesus conquered death once for all, right? And so one day we all rise again to be with him forever, for eternity. Not rising to live out the rest of our years here on earth. There's a big difference between the two. 1 Corinthians 15:20 tells us, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So Jesus sheds a powerful light on our fear of darkness and death. And for us, there's no longer any reason to fear. His light has broken down the door of death and has freed us from any terror that death would hold over us. But his light means more than just victory over the darkness and grave. It also means Jesus will light up the very life we live right now. And Jesus explained to his disciples, John 15:11, I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. There's something about Jesus being part of us that creates a joy and completeness that we didn't have. It can't be taken away. And Paul talks about the feeling, or talks about it as a peace that passes all understanding. You can't even explain it, but it's there. It's just a peace that passes all understanding. That's probably a good way to put it. It's kind of like the joy you feel on a bright, sunshiny summer day. Everything's going good. You're just enjoying yourself, and the birds are singing. You feel the soft breeze on your face, and it's just, there's a joy that brings that you can't really explain. You just know how it feels. You know? And that's how it is for those who have Jesus in our lives. A number of years ago, a woman named Dana Tierney told of feeling like she'd missed out because she didn't believe. She said, over the years, I've come to think I'm missing out. My friends and relatives who rely on God, the real believers, not just the churchgoers, have an expansiveness of spirit. When they walk along a stream, they don't just see water falling over rocks. The sight fills them with ecstasy. They see a realm of hope beyond this world, and I just see a babbling brook. And that was in the Reader's Digest, May 2004. What she was saying was she didn't get the message. They had a depth in the spirit that she didn't have, and she couldn't understand. Isaiah 9:3 says that what was promised with the coming Messiah, with his coming, he, Isaiah 9:3, enlarge the nation and increase their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when dividing the plunder. Their joy is like people who know there will be a harvest. Maybe we don't experience that kind of joy because in today's society, the way we live, we don't really depend on our harvest. We do depend on other people's harvest, but you wouldn't know it because we go shopping at stores and buy things in packages. Right? If we had to depend on a harvest, I think we'd have a little bit more joy when we had a good year and the food came in. They're assured that there would be food on the table because there's food in their pantry. And now their needs are taken care of. They know someone is there who will take care of them and back them up. And so there's this joy. This light from Jesus is a little like walking through a room you've never been in before. Now, we all know how your toes are made to find things in the dark, right? As you're walking around, your toes smash things for you. Or shins or knees, yeah. I always thought shins were for the ball hitches on the back of a pickup truck. Yeah. But this light from Jesus is a little like walking through a room you've never been in before. And if you walk in that room and there are no lights on, you might be a little uneasy in trying to feel your way around the room. You don't know the obstacles in the room, and you're just kind of trying to muddle your way through it. You're not certain what might be there. You might stumble and you might get hurt. But if the lights are on, walk with confidence. See everything. You know what's there. You can just zoom right around it all. There's no longer any obstacles, no longer anything that can truly hurt you and cause you to be troubled, because the light has shed in there and you can see everything. That's the kind of difference Jesus brings to our lives. We no longer walk in darkness with anxiety and unease, but we walk in His light, and our lives are completely different. And that's kind of how it is. But how did God give us that light? How did God intend to give our lives power and hope, peace, joy? Isaiah 9:6, we're going back to messianic prophecy. Isaiah 9. Unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. God stepped into a world that was a dark, empty place. He came down in human form and allowed himself to be put to death for our sins. Just as Isaiah prophesied, the Messiah was to be called Emmanuel, God with us. God could have given us an instruction book, which we already had the law. Very difficult to do, but it was an instruction book. But He could have simply just given an instruction book, and He did in the Bible. We have the Bible as instruction. And it's the best instruction manual that mankind has ever possessed. Because, if you look in the Bible, sin is clearly marked as things that will destroy you, things that will damage you, right? So if you follow the instruction manual, it's the best way to keep yourself safe. So it's the best one we have. But without God being with us, the Bible would be a very dry set of do's and don'ts. But God made a way to be with us. Our lives would lack the ultimate element that could change our lives and give us the light that we need in a very dark world. Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey? I always liked listening to him. I thought he could tell a story blessed. He could tell a story like nobody else. He once told the story of a man who was a kind, decent, mostly good man, generous to his family, upright in his dealings with others, but he didn't believe in all that stuff about Jesus and Christmas. It just didn't make sense to him, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He just could not swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. I'm truly sorry to distress you, he told his wife, but I'm not going to church on Christmas Eve. He said he'd feel like a hypocrite. He would much rather stay home, but that he would wait up for them to come back home. He stayed, they went. Shortly after the family drove away in the car, snow began to fall. He went to the window to watch the flurries getting heavier and heavier. Then he went back to his fireside chair and began to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, then another and another. At first, he thought someone might be throwing snowballs against his living room window, but when he went to the front door, he found a flock of birds huddled miserably in the snow. They had been caught in the storm, and in a desperate search for shelter, they had tried to fly through his large landscape window. He didn't want to just let the poor creatures lie there and freeze, so he remembered in the barn where his children stabled their pony, he could provide a warm shelter if he could direct the birds to it. Quickly put on his coat and galoshes, trampled through the deepening snow to the barn, opened the door wide, and turned on a light, but the birds did not come in. He figured food would entice them in, and he hurried back to the house, got some breadcrumbs, sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow-lighted, wide-open doorway of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to flap helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around them, waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction except into the warm, lighted barn. Then he realized they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, I am a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know they can trust me, that I'm not trying to hurt them, but to help them. But how? Any move he made tended to frighten them, confuse them. They just would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. If only I could be a bird myself, he thought. If only I could be a bird and mingle with them and speak their language and tell them not to be afraid and show them the way to be safe and warm in the barn. But I'd have to be one of them so they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sound of the wind. He stood there listening to the bells. Listening, he heard the bells pealing the glad tidings of Christmas. He sank to his knees. See, in the story, the man finally realized what God had to do so that we recognized he was coming to save us. Dealing with these birds, and look, I don't know if the story had any fact or fiction or combination of both, but it paints a good picture. It paints a good picture, and this man finds himself in a place where he's desperately trying to help these creatures who just keep doing the wrong thing. And he can't get them to where they need to be. So finally he's realizing, if I could just somehow be one of them and lead them and guide them, then I could get them into safety. And he falls to his knees in the snow because he realizes that's what his wife's been telling him. That's exactly what God did. Right? He came in the form of a man in order so that we could have that provision to be safe. Amen. Lord, we just thank you for all that you've done in our lives and in this church. We just are so thankful for the provision that you've made for us. Jesus coming, being born of a virgin, fulfilling the prophecies of the Old Testament, and eventually dying and being raised again and providing our way to be with you eternally. Lord, we're very grateful and thankful for that. Just pray that this Christmas, everybody in here would just remember through the commercialization, through the gifts and through the family functions, be able to take some time and remember exactly why we celebrate Christmas. Lord, and we are very thankful for all that you've done.